everything, good and bad, is much more material than it was 15 years ago. We have much more apparent climate impacts that are happening. I think it's much harder to escape rhetorically any discussion of whether or not it's anthropogenic. We're just at a position where all of this stuff matters, and it matters more to more people than it did when I started working.
Welcome to Climate Papa. This is a show about climate change, technology, and parenthood.
Well, welcome to Climate Papa, a show about the intersection of climate change, technology, and parenthood. And I'm your host, Ben Idelson. I'm based in Seattle, and I invest in climate startups with a new fund called Step Change. And I'm a papa to two kids, a 6-year-old girl and a 3-year-old boy. Beginning in 2020, Nat Bullard began publishing a presentation about the state of decarbonization. And this last year's deck was phenomenal and probably one of the most useful artifacts one could consume if they wanted to understand what was happening in 2023. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, I recommend you pause for a moment, head to the show notes, and click the top link. It'll take you to Nat's website and his presentation. Sit down and give yourself a solid 1 to 2 hours to digest. You'll quickly learn so much about the world. You'll fly through slides about the state of energy consumption, international coal exports, the shifting tides of climate information warfare. You'll learn about the amazing efficiency of modern lighting, the explosive and exponential growth of solar, the cost curves of batteries. You'll then dive into financial market flows, the effects of interest rate hikes, and the state of the EV market, the shifts in corporate sustainability reporting in carbon markets, and then you'll realize you're only halfway through, maybe at slide 100 of 200. And so you'll buckle up to dive into wind and energy trading. You'll learn about the centrality of shipping fossil fuels, and you'll get a tour of the whole new frontier of carbon removal and advanced market commitments. You'll learn what is abundant, a lot in the world of solar and storage, and what is scarce, grid capacity, transformers, and a number of really important materials. And Nat wraps the deck with some absolutely fascinating charts on food waste, and changing habits around animal proteins. Phew. All right. So please go spend some time there. It'll expand your horizons, and it will give you context for the conversation that's ahead. This conversation is mostly not about what's in the deck. This conversation is instead about its creator, Nat. It's about how and why he makes this each year. Who is it for, and how the process of making a cheer makes him think about the moment we're in right now, and why thinking about that is so important. It's also a bit about Nat the person, and yes, the dad. So why is Nat worth listening to on all things climate and decarbonization? Well, Nat worked at Bloomberg New Energy Finance and Bloomberg Green for over 13 years, and he finished his time there as the chief content officer. And for those not familiar, these are some of the premier media entities analyzing society's progress in decarbonization. And so he's been in this information flow very intensely for a very long time. All right, well, with that, let's welcome Nat to the show.
Hi, I'm Nat Bullard. I'm an energy, climate, and technology analyst. I have one daughter. She's 9 years old, and I'm based in Singapore.
How long have you been there?
We've been here coming up on 8 months now.
Okay, so this is relatively recent.
It's fairly recent, yeah.
Settling in, I'm sure, a multiple layered big transition.
The most important thing, I think, to get right was school, which we set out as the prime mover and the first priority. That's come together very nicely, and a lot of things just flow from there.
How's your 9-year-old taking to Singapore?
Well, it was an adjustment, but not, I think, one that was terribly difficult in the macro level, because the school is very well run. We live in a big compound with a bunch of other apartment buildings, as one does in Singapore, that's full of other kids her age. There's actually in a contained way a very high degree of freedom, and there's a lot of socialization that goes on here amongst all of her friends, and it's good. It's definitely different. I think you sort of take a lot of things out of what is relatively scarce private space here in Singapore and put it out into much larger public space, different than the US. But I think that works great, So playtime that happens outside, like here in our compound or at one of the big parks, a lot of activities that take place at school itself. The school is very much center of things, more so than I think it was in our last year in the US where we were. So I gotta like it. I think it's great. It lends a lot of focus for her, and it also lends a lot of focus for us as parents and thinking about how we organize all of our activities.
Whenever I hear people say like, oh, like how are kids going to handle that change or transition? I always think people underestimate kids and overestimate adults' inabilities to transition. Kids tend to be much more adaptable than we give them credit, and able to, default. Like they have less prior expectations about how things must be.
That's right. That's right. The move from house to apartment is a bigger deal for a parent, I think, than it is for a kid. The move to different sets of not educational priorities, but like a different manner of teaching to some extent, and a different set of educational philosophies is the sort of thing that we as adults spend a lot of time negotiating when we move between jobs. The equivalent of that for children, they're much more supple and much more open in many ways to change.
How did becoming a parent for you? I mean, you were already working in climate. You go back to early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Mid 2000s. In fact, the kid bisects. It's like right in the middle of my time working in and around climate. So a kid is excellent in this context in terms of giving you a sense of longer term focus. That it gives you a chance to think even more about longer timelines and think beyond the business cycle, so to speak. I'm in the unusual position here of doing this for work already, as you say. And so if anything, it helps you internalize it more rather than, because it's always been highly externalized in my case. It's always been highly externalized by the fact that this is what I do for a living and this is what people know me for. It pulls this sort of external purpose in a career a little bit more close to home. It's something that becomes more clear as an element of how one thinks as a family, not just how you think as an individual or a professional.
Your move to Singapore and the way that you live there, I imagine also integrates that in a different way, just being in a denser environment, it sounds like, than you were, and then you're living in it in a kind of more intentional and intense way.
Yes. You live in a world where all of these things are made very apparent at, I think, a more everyday level. So the Singapore government, for instance, has a public plan, I believe, out to the year 2100 for thinking about climate. And we're also in a place where at 1 degree, more or less, of north latitude, we have a monsoon season, which is past. We're now entering, listeners, imagine air quotes, hot season. It's always very warm here, but a relatively drier period. And you have a constant, tangible sense of climate itself. And so these things are much more apparent. There's also a lot more planning that happens around the things that are a big part of mitigation or should be parts of mitigation in other parts of the world. So public transit, for instance, I live on a long residential block. There will be a new MRT, so a new subway station opening at the end of the road in a couple of weeks. And it's just viewed as sort of a normal thing. And in fact, when I was first scoping out the flat where we live, I was very curious because I could see it was under construction, and I was sort of asking around, and then I was looking for media resources. I'm like, what's the timeline? How much is it delayed? When do we expect it to be pushed further or go into another level of review? Right. I'm sort of channeling my impressions from being a resident of New York City years ago and still visiting all the time. And the reaction here was like, well, the date has been set. And in fact, there was a hearing from some government officials where they finally committed to the opening date, and it was almost a non-issue because it's expected that this will be happening. And it's part of a plan that people can literally plan around. But I find things like this to be very, very healthy and very helpful. Like they make the long-term very apparent in real time in a way that is good. It's good for anyone who wants to be thinking about the future.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest challenges that most people have with reckoning both with climate time horizons, but just also generally infrastructure time horizons. And I think especially so in a place where we don't have infrastructure time horizons that we ever actually hit, then you're like, okay, if the date is beyond maybe 18 to 24 months, right. It's kind of just way in the future.
That's right.
If ever. And that's pretty problematic on a number of levels.
And we in almost all of the U.S. are part of a world that is more similar to the world we were born in than not.
Yep.
Where we've had a lot of expansion and growth and where the economy has been pretty dynamic, it is a recognizable landscape. It's a recognizable geography. And many of the places that I've lived and visited in Asia are not that way. They're going through a transformation of the sort that would have happened in Victorian London or in turn of the 20th century New York, for instance, or in Los Angeles 4 decades later. And so in the United States in particular, there's been a sort of a long drafting off of the paid-in, built-up capital that we have. It's very interesting to watch how that is and maybe further changing over time. But here it is just part of everyday life across any part of developing Asia, that like things are being built up, they're growing, they're developing, they're changing, they're expanding in scope and scale. That's where we live. It's the lived experience of people here as opposed to some kind of abstraction.
How do you describe what it is that you do, especially now that you're not inside of an organization? And then, we'll get to the deck as an artifact of that, but curious how you think about the entire set of things that you do.
So the main thing I'm trying to do is get as clear a possible view of the present day as I can, which is the best way to then allow all sorts of people and organizations to think about the future. We live in a very complex information landscape around sort of climate writ large, not necessarily about the climate-specific data, so to speak. I think those things are actually very clear and very apparent, if very voluminous, but more the sort of activity taking place at the market and strategic level within companies and within economies. There's such a sort of breadth of information that exists that I think it's very easy for people to cherry pick arguments for or against whatever it is that they want to support or detract. And it's also hard to know everything. And I will be the first person to tell you that if anything, I feel less comprehensive now than I did maybe 15 years ago by the nature of how much things have grown. But what I'm trying to do is capture a clear view of the present day so that we can have constructive visions of the future as we go forward. And if I look at the last couple of years, and in the last year, 2023 in particular, it requires something that is rhetorically a little bit challenging for a lot of people, I think, to look at, which is that you have to keep both things true at once. We are both simultaneously in the most rapid growth in investment in a new suite of energy and climate-related technologies ever. They're making meaningful contributions to the electricity sector in particular, and beginning to make similar in the automobile sector. And at the same time, we have record high consumption of coal and natural gas. Oil is approaching the same thing right now. In fact, it is, I think, at records. We have record high anthropogenic emissions from fossil fuel combustion. We have the highest parts per million CO2 concentration we've had in hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. We have temperatures that are not only quite out of frame for the long-run averages that we look to, but are also changing very rapidly. But both these things are true at once. And when I was putting the deck together, I described one set of things as stocks and another as flows. And the challenge is to understand them both working both in parallel in terms of what drives them, motivates them, moves them forward, and also how the one might impact the other. And really only the flows-based set of things, the new, so to speak, is what's there to change the stocks-based things, the incumbent world that we still live fully within right now.
That challenge of holding those, not just two truths, I think in a way,
Many.
The 200 truths. Each slide slide you have is a sort of scale of market truth, or sub points, and I'm sure there's ones that you cut because it's not like 200 is the exact answer.
Oh no, God, it's definitely an edit. It's definitely an edit compared to where I began.
And all of the things are true, and so it sounds like if I were to understand, like at the core, your motivation for putting the deck together is the same as your kind of overall motivation, which is tell the story of the present, both the state of climate and where we're at, and also the state of kind of everything around it that makes the bar, and try and give folks that care a snapshot of that on a regular cadence. Is that right?
That's right. If you notice, I have almost no projections. And if they are projections, they are projections based on things such as capacity, like announced, promised, financed capacity. And that's pretty much it, which was another kind of analyst journey over time where you move from finding strength in your analytical position, from looking very far ahead and finding that people agree with you or at least are willing to follow along with that vision. And then you move sort of, I think with greater seniority, you move closer towards the point where I am now, where you're like, no, I would just like a very clear view of the present to help me inform my thinking. So I don't have the charts to 2050. I don't have long-term outlooks to 2060 or things like that. Generally speaking, I'm just looking to observe the moment we're in right now.
It's such an interesting statement to think about that, the more senior you get as an analyst and kind of you've been around, you stop thinking you can forecast into the future and you just want clarity about the present. I think there's almost a counterintuitive. You would think that you earn the right to forecast, but it sounds a bit kind of like the opposite.
It gives you more nimbleness, actually, in a way that can be a little bit jarring, frankly, but like more ability to interrogate your priors. Okay, so what didn't happen? Why didn't it happen? Let me think about that early and often rather than through a big kind of multi-party review. Like I don't want to do a post-mortem. I want in real time to be adjusting based on what happens. You can see this happen, for instance, and in the solar sector, and a couple of things in there. One is that even the very best shops at doing projections and near-term forecasting constantly have to revise intra-year just because of the nature of what is revealed from a highly distributed industry that runs according to its own cadence. And two is that back testing any of these things will prove that almost all of the long-term projections did not eventuate, and even the ones that came close were wildly undershooting what actually happened. As my friend Kingsmill Bond at RMI says, you can think of any kind of fancy model that you want. I'm paraphrasing. The best way to have thought about the long-term trajectory for wind and solar technologies is a logistic curve. Like you can go in there and try to interpolate all kinds of reasoning and policies and market analysis. The thing that is actually best described it is a function.
Who are you making this deck for? I almost have to imagine that part of it is the answer is like yourself. You must be just driven to want to have this level of clarity, but do you have a particular kind of viewer in mind, as you're putting this together?
But you're right. It's me.
Yeah.
I made this for me because this is the set of heuristics that I need to understand the market. And my hope was that there would be some extrinsic value to that for the market if I was to put it out there. It's also the only way to get any feedback on it is to do it in public and to see what people find most cogent, most coherent, most useful for them. So no, I make this for me, and I make it public because I like seeing how people interact with it, how they react, where they want to do more inquiry, what they disagree with. Although it's hard, generally speaking, to disagree with things that are empirical.
Right.
You can disagree with the conclusions to be drawn about it.
I feel like now when it drops, there's this collective, excitement, at least in the places I finally have tuned my feed. Is there just a sense of, okay, like more people have seen the truth about the data, and that makes me like happy because now we're operating at least more based on like present tense truth? Or is there do you have some aim on like what you hope this to cause in the industry?
I don't know what the market thinks of it. I don't know what impact it has. I guess you'd have to sort of pose that question to every one of the people that is taking a look at it. What my hope is that people have a shared understanding of the present day. Back to my original point, and that they're armed intellectually with the most current information that they can get, and that it's also very clearly stated. That I state where impossible, like there's always a source in case people want to go and look it up. There's always a correction for nominal and real dollars. There's always a statement that something is estimated if it's been estimated, if it's a projection, and just that it provides a basis for people to then do their own inquiries. People should always be seeking something new. It's meant to be the beginning of inquiry for people. people use it as their jumping off point to do whatever it is that they do. There are some narratives that I would hope people pick up. In particular, there are other narratives that I'm surprised that people seem to be fixated on. Let's put it that way.
Let's talk about the how, because I think I was just going back through it again this week, and the breadth was just even deeper. Like, I think what shocks me about it is, the breadth of stuff you cover, from obviously, the big industries, but also the kind of way that you connect the dots between solar and farming for corn, and like the fact that you're holding kind of the whole thing. I know that's probably you're probably in your mind saying, well, no, I'm not, like, I'm missing this and I had to edit this down. But relative to most people, even most people in climate, I think you're holding more of it and at a deeper level in order to get to this quality and kind of breadth of output. And so I would just love to understand how you do that.
So I have,
So
I have the advantage of really, like, all I do is information. That's what my job is. So I don't work in a sector. I don't have an operational role. I work in information. That is, in information, and to an extent, where I'm doing public writing as well, ideas. Or where I'm putting together a presentation, I work in sort of synthesis and ideas. So I try not to have blinders on. I have industries that I inherently find more interesting than others, which is always a challenge to sort of work through. But mostly I'm just very acquisitive on a very kind of neutral basis of information that I think informs us better. So that could be from any sector. It could be about almost any topic, as long as it's kind of energy and climate and transport and building and industry related. And it could be of any level of granularity. And so the way that I assemble these in running fashion through the years, I just have a deck. I grab things, put them in there. I take notes, and I'm in an accumulation process for months, like all the way through basically November. And at that point, I begin to try to create some sort of narrative structure over it. Not cherry picking so much as saying, out of these things that I have, where do I find sort of thematics that run through them? That's the part that is sort of more editorialized, I suppose, is that I'm looking to say, if I'm going to apply some lenses on top of all of this, what are they? What am I using to look through this? And this was the effort that I did last year, was like stocks and flows on the one hand, or things that are abundant and things that are scarce. Wherein groups, people, industries, organizations make commitments, how are they faring against those commitments? Another thing would be like looking for inflections. Where are things rising? Where are things falling? When do we have tipping points? These are by no means anything particularly sophisticated as analytical tricks. The thing that is not often done is to do them thematically across sectors rather than as an observation vertically within a sector.
And is there something inherent, you think, in doing that is either just how your brain thinks about it, or what you think? Like, I think that's right. Like, there's plenty of memos you can get, I'm sure, out there about the state of the solar industry this year, and you're just in solar land, right, for hundreds of pages, right?
Yep.
What do you think is uniquely going on for you that's trying to see it across sectors?
Because I'm not a practitioner, I'm not bounded by the need to respond to a particular inquiry. I don't need to say what the year-on-year growth in PJM solar interconnections was. Now, I happen to have put information like that into the deck, but it's not a requirement for me. Whereas if you are the Solar Energy Industries Association, you really better do that. You ought to be providing that, because that's what people want. It is a quantum of information that people need to some degree and have come to expect, just as importantly. And I'm not bound to that. So I think that there's a paradoxical strength in being more editorial. I will say that I feel like that is hopefully earned, in the sense that, like, I have some I have experience doing this and people come to trust me on that, but I also very much want people to call out and say that I think this is not the necessary right approach. But it's inherently individual and it's inherently editorial. And the other thing is that I write, not so much as I used to when I was at Bloomberg, where I wrote for 10 years pretty much outside the paywall, but I'm still writing. And that act of having to be concise, thematic, heuristic, and also aiding people in ways of thinking rather than just conveying information is part of the motivation behind something like this.
Are you ever tempted to take some of the work that goes into this and form it into a written narrative? Or do you think that just this information is so suited to the visual and
every deck expands to the point where it should become a research paper, and every research paper expands to the point where it should become a deck? I prefer the visual medium because it's another way to communicate. Again, I feel like I feel like I'm a little bit more at peace with this particular way because I also do the writing. If I did only one or the other, I might feel differently. I find the two of them to be very complementary to each other in terms of how I think. I like the format though because the visuals allow you to capture moments, and it's also more nimble to add and subtract things to help shape the narrative. If I was to write a book about this, it would be like painting the Firth of Forth Bridge. By the time it's done, I should probably be starting over. And it's one of the reasons that I like the higher frequency, lower latency publication schedule of writing every week or every couple of weeks, is that you're continually able to revisit these ideas. But also, I wanted to set out something that sort of goes beyond that particular interval of time. And so yearly feels about right because it's part of people's own planning cadences. And I wanted to time it early in the year so that it's simultaneously a review on the year before and a look ahead to what comes after.
Right. And so what are you doing in those months? It's, you're sitting in you're already always kind of consuming this information. And as you do, you're kind of just putting things on slides, knowing that this is going to come downstream, or are you, which kind of almost sounds like, I'm imagining, you're more in a river collecting the things that swim by that kind of strike you, or are you like, oh no, I really want to go hunt for this, an understanding over here, and what's going on in your workflow?
Both. So the early phase is just being highly acquisitive. Something comes, I want to grab that, I'm going to put that in there. I don't even know if I'm going to look at it further. As you evolve towards building the thematic nature of this later on, that's when I get to the point where I'm like, no, I really do need to seek this out. That's when I have a more active outbound looking for information rather than just having it come to me. And that tends to be more towards the back half of the year, really the back quarter of the year, is that I'm looking specifically for things that fit a specific hole in the mix. I need to know the battery recycling capacity and demand balance looking forward. That's something that I need to find. And I'm very fortunate that a lot of times people will happily provide that, knowing the context into which it's going to be used. I tend to just ask them, I've seen that you've talked about this in public once, or you posted about it on LinkedIn. Would you be interested in sharing? That is, from a process perspective, something that has thankfully become much easier over time, is that people can look to this deck that has a large amount of context, a big window of context in which all kinds of other things are, and saying okay, provided it's public information, I'm happy to have it, in there alongside other stuff. So yeah, it's mostly acquisitive at first. It's somewhat reactive, and then towards the end, it becomes sort of proactive, looking for specific things that I know I need to get. So basically, when I do my punch list version of this, that generally starts in December, there's 50 things where I'm like, I need to get this update on the Copernicus ERA5 model. I need to have this investment figure. I need to have that capacity figure. I need to know this trade balance. Those things that I'm all right, I've got to feed these in. And a lot of times it's these are just standards that I should have. I should probably know how much money got invested. But there's others where I'm during the year, maybe we noticed in September that it was on track to be this. And so year-to-date data in September looked like this. What does it look like now? it would be unfair to wrap the story
Stop
without
there.
some kind of conclusion to it, unless that really is the story is contained in and of there, and I'm capable of sort of wrapping it up there and closing it off there.
This is a pretty solo activity, right? Of your own information digestion. And I'm kind of curious, what does that look like? And how does being in Singapore affect your ability to do that? Does it almost strengthen it because your time zone shifted from everyone's busyness, or vice versa?
There's a little bit of sort of algorithmic process to this. It's like you've been doing it long enough, you sort of start to know things. You're like, oh, that looks very different than what I recall from before, so I'm just going to go ahead and get that. Or it's the kind of insight that I could see becoming more important as this or that or the other evolves. Singapore is helpful because there's time zone, but more it's a sort of a parallax of allowing you to be not quite so focused on like very particular politics and politicking around this or that or the other idea in one or the other market.
Right.
It allows you to do a little bit of a look through. I found that in particular to be true looking at ESG commitment type information and fund flows, where there's a lot happening in the US, but the bulk of it is elsewhere, and the trends are very different between these different markets. And it's just helpful to be able to look at those very clearly and to sort of lay them out empirically for people to get behind, right? And that's easier to do here because it's actually not part of the discussion. It's not something that's coming up that often as a matter of debate. It's viewed, these debates that are in the US are viewed largely as a US related debate. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine this is probably an overswing of a statement, but I'm guessing you can probably feel yourself easily being pulled from a US-centric data flows and analyst to just a global one, just by, like it's just easier when you're not here, swarmed in whatever is going on here.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's right. It's easier to take a broader look and to understand too that there are different motivating factors in different markets for what people look for and want. Different expectations about the nature of growth, the nature of energy security, the nature of technology. All these things are different elsewhere. So
putting all of this together, having this lens of kind of all of these things, sitting in all the information about all of it, like how do you feel these days about I don't want to ask the kind of classic like optimist pessimist, because I think as we've already demonstrated, like that's kind of like that doesn't quite have the nuance, but just like in a day of we're doing this type of work, where does your kind of climate psychology sit and bounce around, given the breadth and depth you have?
It's a great question, and I think of it as if I do a bit of a retrospective here, is that everything, good and bad, is much more material than it was 15 years ago. We have much more apparent climate impacts that are happening. I think it's much harder to escape rhetorically any discussion of whether or not it's anthropogenic. We have orders of magnitude more money being invested on the clean side of the ledger, while we have a continuing trend and volumes on all of the dirty side of the ledger. We actually have wind and solar comprising, as of 2022, 12% of global power generation. It's going to be significantly higher this year. EVs are the only source of growth in the global auto market. All of these things are more material in terms of how they impact incumbent systems, even if you can't see a lot of it yet. And all of the climate impacts that we think about are very apparent. And there's a policy and political materiality that really wasn't there years ago. And we're just at a position where all of this stuff matters, and it matters more to more people than it did when I started working.
That's very well said. I also don't pretend to make a lot of forecasts, but I would forecast that only will be more true over the next 5 years, right? Just based on what we do know about the climate system. Wherever we're at now is going to be like 5 years from now, it's going to be just more intense, and these markets are going to be only much bigger. And we're going to politically, the Overton window is going to keep shifting dramatically as the effects are ramping up. I mean, seeing what's happening over the insurance industry in the last 2 years is like how this is now. I mean, it was very different than 10 years ago. Like it's.
I think with many of these things, it's probably easier to predict far out than
Yes.
it is to think what's happening near term. One of the reasons that I try to provide as much clarity as I can in the near term. But getting from here to there is not necessarily as simple a path as people might think, and it can have a lot of manifestations within it. So, yeah, I think it's important for us, again, to keep a lot of these things true at once, but also to have some faith in the way that technology works and in human ingenuity. And to your point on the Overton window, this is the part that for a casual observer might be hard to know, is that we're now talking meaningfully about doing things that were viewed as science experiment / impossible even 10 years ago. And I find that to be very heartening. That's a really positive thing. And to an extent, if that becomes normalized, that progress is part of what we're doing, I actually think that that's very helpful. But it doesn't mean that it becomes a passive thing. It means that, we're open to asserting and exerting attention and energy and capital and technology on all of these new areas.
Do you feel like you have another 10 years in you to kind of keep trying to give the best view of the present to everyone and keep that lens on it?
I would hope so, because it's so dynamic that if you just if you set the same goals for yourself, you're looking at something different every few years. That's the way that I think about it. Like, I don't need to change the goals of what I'm doing if the landscape itself is changing and growing very rapidly. In fact, I'm probably better served by trying to take a similar approach to a different world each time. That's the strength. Like, if it's a very stable world, then you should probably alter approaches a lot. If it's a very dynamic world, maybe there's a benefit to taking the approach and sticking to it. So that's sort of the way that I would hope to look ahead in the next 10 years, is being sort of true to purpose insofar as possible, knowing that there's going to be an increasingly dynamic world out there to look at.
That's a great way to view it. And, concretely, I look forward to, that's just 2,000 slides to consume.
Well, we'll see. Yeah, that's right. That's a lot. And over time, something fun to backtest, something fun to look at and say which of these proved to be an advance notice on the future, and which of them were sort of dead branches.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing with like time. I don't know what it is mentally. I hope someone's coined a term for this, and I should track it down. 6 years from now sounds like just yesterday, right? 2018. Mm-hmm. It sounds like just yesterday. 6 years from now, 2030.
Sounds like the future. That's right.
Sounds like the future, in one of these dates that like we'll never get to. 2030. Like, that's when all this policy is supposed to happen. That's when this company said they're going to be net zero. You're like, that's just like 2018, like, which was just the other day.
Yep.
And so it's a very weird. Yeah, I don't know what that says for all of this, but I think about that quite often when people are happy to kind of punt psychologically into the future so far. Well, other than the decks, how else can people kind of consume your work and follow along? And
as I said, I'm trying to get the writing muscles working again. It's good writing is a habit and a workout, but it's mutually reinforcing. So you can go to my site and sign up, nathanielbullard.com. Easy to find. If you've seen the slides, you've seen the site where they live. So just, pop your name in there, pop your email address in there, and look for stuff from me. To be honest, I'm trying to evaluate what is the right cadence. I'm not a 3 times a week writer, and I never was. So I'm less than 1 time per week at the moment, but I'm trying to sort of establish a cadence and, in a sense, establish a writing relationship that is going. So it's getting there, and I'm easy to get in touch with as well on my site, so it shouldn't be any trouble to find me. I do less on social media than I used to, certainly on the platform formerly known as Twitter, but I am on LinkedIn, and I tend to post a fair amount of stuff there. But the direct is still probably the best way. So on my site, where I update what I've been up to, and the newsletters and columns and writing that I'm sending out through the same.
Excellent. And of course, we'll link to all the things in the show notes and otherwise. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Nat, for the time. It was really fun to dive into how you actually put this together.
Thank you. It was a great process examination, and you put together some outstanding notes for that purpose. So I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, that's a wrap on episode 17 of Climate Papa. Thank you all for listening. That was a really special experience. I'm not going to lie. I'm a bit of a Nat Bullard fanboy, and so shortly after his deck was released in January, I reached out and was delighted that he was up for unpacking all of this a few months later. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And in case you missed it or are new to the show, in our last episode, I unpacked what I'm spending most of my time on when not working on this podcast or more likely hanging out with my family. I launched a new venture fund earlier this year called Step Change. In our last episode, episode 16, I shared all about the fund and what we're up to. And I also shared that we're still open for a few more remaining investors. So if you're intrigued, go give that a listen. We are open for another couple weeks, and then we're planning to cap out and focused on investing and partnering with great companies. In fact, yesterday, one of the companies we've been working with for a long time, Bioenergy, just had a big launch. They are building the plaid of utility data, and I think going to be a pretty important layer to everything that happens in the years to come. We also just made our 5th investment into a really cool company called Eli Technologies. They're helping everyone get all the incentives out the door to home decarbonization projects. It's been really fun working with all of these founders and can't wait for what the rest of the year is going to bring. And please feel free to shoot me a note at any time to ben@climatepapa.com. I love hearing from listeners, anything they thought about the episode, guest suggestions, or just a note about whatever's on your mind. And with that, our music is the Balkan Bump remix of Mellow Kind of Hype by Slink and Lazy Syrup Orchestra. Let's have them take us out.
On we go like...